This is Shalom World Podcast.
Welcome to Voyage. This is a podcast where we take you to the world of the Apocalypse of John. This is the book of Revelation. I am your host, Frances Hogan. We're told in verse 2 that the great harlot rules enthroned beside the abundant waters. Some people identify this with Rome, beside the Adriatic Sea, but this is actually a literal description of Babylon at the time of Nebuchadnezzar, much centuries earlier, because the capital city was surrounded by canals on all sides, which irrigated the countryside and gave them abundant harvests. So it just means an empire that's absolutely flourishing. But John actually gives us a meaning for the abundant waters if you go down to verse 15. And he explains that the abundant waters are the peoples, the populations, the nations, and the languages. In other words, that he's actually talking about a worldwide organization, which is true of the Catholic Church in the 21st century. And he also says that all the kings of the earth committed fornication with her. And we have the fact that in the Vatican, diplomats from all over the world actually go and make their presentations in the Vatican. And alliances are made with countries all over the world. So she has made all the population of the world drunk with the wine of her adultery. So it means that when we adopt the ways of the world, she can lead everybody into apostasy because this extraordinary influence that she has. And we know that, as I've said to you before, since the 1960s, when the abyss was opened and the demons were let out all over the earth and all kinds of disasters happened, that the church opened its doors to the world. And unfortunately, the influence of the world has come in. The situation we're actually in now, which is the new world order that is being set up, this world empire that's being set up, she's very much part of it. Okay. But the problem with the world organization is that they want a natural religion. They want God out of it. They don't mind you having a religion, but it's the state that is to be worshipped. Okay. So as I said before, Satan doesn't mind you being religious as long as you worship him. We saw that very clearly in Luke 4, verse 7. Satan appears in many guises, as St. Paul told us in 2 Corinthians 11:14. And the false prophet is one of these guises. That's the thing we have to actually look at, because he looks like an angel of light, meaning a messenger of Christ, but in actual fact, he's an angel of darkness, which is a wolf in sheep's clothing. And so the true followers of Christ today, we have to be completely certain about discernment, that we can actually see what we're looking at. We can discern truth from falsehood. We can discern the faithful followers of Christ, who are the followers of the Lamb. We've met them in chapter 14 from verse 1. And we can recognize the anti-church as well, or the apostate church, which is a harlot. Okay. So verse 3 says that the apostasy will be worldwide because all the populations of the world are involved. And if you just simply look at the media today, you'll see that all the nations of the earth are in turmoil. All of them are in trouble. And governments all over the world are permitting their populations to live opposite of the 10 commandments. If you take the 10 commandments of God, governments today say, yes, you may commit adultery. You may kill so long it's the infants and the old. You may do it. You may worship anybody you like, and so on and so forth. So they make anti-Christian and anti-God laws. Okay. So for me, the final Judas figure in the Bible is the false prophet. And if you understand him as a final Judas figure, then you won't be too put out about it. But we need to recognize him and to recognize what he does and so on. Now, in verse 3, John actually sees an image of the harlot, and that enables him to begin to try and describe the mystery that he's being asked to discuss. And he says she lives in a desert. Now, in the Bible, a desert is a place where demons abide. That's where they live. And if this represents the anti-church or the unfaithful ones, the ones who have gone into apostasy, then it means that you are looking at a spiritual desolation there. Okay, so this couldn't have been true of pagan Rome at the time of John. It has to be today that he's actually talking about. So in verse 3, the woman is actually riding a scarlet beast, which has 7 heads and 10 horns. So the beast that we came to know about in chapter 13 is being spoken about again here. Okay. She sits on the beast, so she's part of that system. We're told that she's dressed in purple and scarlet and glittering with gold and jewels and pearls. I may have already told you, I don't know, that Rome at the time had filthy riches. So much so that the Jewish rabbis said that of the 10 kebabs of riches that God made on the earth, Rome took 9 of them and left the rest of the world only sharing 1. But the description that John is giving to us here is very similar to the description that Ezekiel gives in chapter 28, verses 13 to 15, about the king of Tyre. And on the deeper level, John is using that image that you can find there in Ezekiel, but on a deeper level, what John is saying, and you need to take note of this, that Satan uses commerce, he uses trading to bring us down. And if you look that in the last 40 years, that our countries have ceased from being nations and have become economies. Trading is the thing. This is the thing that's going on all over the earth. And the only thing that seems to be important is the trading and the trading and the trading. Okay, sure sign that Satan is around. Now, Ezekiel also describes the fall of Lucifer in chapter 8 of his gospel, of his book, in verses 16 to 19. We'll deal with that later in chapter 18. We're told that the harlot's dress is that of royalty and immorality. Now, if you look at the Caesars in Rome, they were the royals or the royalty, famous for their immorality as well. But what John wants you to see is that this harlot is depending on the beast and not on God. Now, if you go back to Lot at the time of Genesis, when this phenomenon began, Lot was depending on the commerce in Sodom for all the benefits that he could get, okay? Not leaning on God as Abraham was out in the fields as a nomad. And so this has come to its absolute height in the harlot here, where it is the world's riches that it wants, not God's riches, okay? But if you go back to the first century, you find that the Jews of the diaspora all over the Middle East poured money into the temple and into its priesthood. And if you look at the Catholic Church today, the people all over the world pour money into the Vatican as well, in Peter's pence, for example. In verse 14, we're told that the woman holds a wine cup in her hands, and Jeremiah 51:7 says that Babylon itself was the wine cup, the gold cup. But Ezekiel 23, verses 35 to 37 says that after she has debauched the world with the wine cup is the symbol of all her sins, then she will have to face the judgment of God. So if you go back for a moment to Pergamum in Revelation 2, we were told there that that was the seat of Satan because emperor worship, idolatry, immorality, and false prophets. That's exactly the problem. And so the church there in Pergamum was in real trouble. Okay. So Pergamum was John's example to show how Rome could actually enforce its false worship through the local governments. Okay. If you turn that into the 21st century, then you have the New World Order today dominating the whole world through regional governments, which are no longer independent governments, but actually dependent on this superpower. In verse 5, John is given the harlot's name, and the harlot's name is Babylon the Great. Now, one of the very difficult things about chapter 17 is that John seems to identify the false prophet and the beast as one. They're called the same thing. And yet he separates them because the beast is going to kill the harlot. Okay? So they are one and they are separate at the same time. That's very interesting because the apostasy identifies with the world. They're one. And yet they're different because you're only called an apostate if you belong to the Lord. And I'll show you this, the logic of the killing of the harlot through this way. So what's in a name? A name is an identity. So she has identified with the beast. Okay. But we found earlier in chapter 7 and chapter 9 that God's people had his name on their foreheads. They identify with the Lord. And the followers of the Lamb in chapter 14, and we'll see it again in chapter 22, they have the Lamb's name on their forehead. They're identified with him. And the servants of the beast have his mark. Notice I didn't say name on the forehead. Okay. So you're talking about identity. And what John is saying to us, and what I'm saying to us as well, at this point in history, is who do you identify with? Who is your Lord? Whose name do you carry? Who do you carry in your heart? That is eternally important to you as an individual. And it's your choice, okay? So, because the name on the forehead is a public declaration as to whom you have given yourself to. So, verse 5 says that this woman is the mother of harlots. She is the great harlot. In other words, there were other harlots before. So, if you go back to Ezekiel again, he called the two kingdoms of Israel and Judah, called them the harlot sisters. But here we have Harlot the Great. There's something different about her because she has worldwide influence. And therefore, her ability to corrupt is on a scale completely different to the northern and southern kingdoms of Judah. They were small kingdoms, they were small places, and their influence was not anything like this at all. How can you corrupt the whole world today? It's through the mass means of communication. You get a message out to the whole world in seconds. You don't have to wait. In the ancient world, it took time to get a message to get from A to B. It doesn't take time now. Everything is instantaneous. And therefore, everything is coming faster and faster because of this. It doesn't take the time that it took in the past. So since John has identified the harlot with the beast, then he can say that she is drunk with the blood of the saints and the blood of the martyrs of Jesus. If you're identified with him, you're one with him, and that's that. So in the end times, the times we're living in, what does that equate to? I think it equates to the fact that the church has become very worldly. And I mean worldwide. I also mean in all its branches. And it tolerates abortion. That's the world's way. That's the death of the innocents. It has gone through religious wars, killing other people who were also claiming to be members of the body of Christ, which is an absolute disobedience to the Lord. And having alliances with secular powers. That's all identification with the beast, okay? And she also represents the Babylon that crucified the Lord as well. So the church is compromised with the world, and therefore the church is identified now with Laodicea. And Laodicea got a very serious warning from the Lord. You are neither hot nor cold. I could spew you out of my mouth. Very serious warning from him. So the church is compromised with the world and its sinful ways, but the secular world actually doesn't like the church. Now, I'm going to show you the logic of how it just turns against the church. The church has turned to the world, but the world doesn't want to have anything to do with her. And so the world will turn around and blame the church for everything and therefore destroy it. I want to remind you that in 1976, the person who became Pope John Paul II said in Philadelphia in America 2 years before he became Pope, I'm only going to give you the exact piece, I'm not going to give you all the rest of it. We are now entering, he said, the final confrontation between the church and the anti-church, the Christ and the Antichrist. That was 1976. That's when he said it. And before he died in 2005, he said, we are far gone in the book of Revelation, much further than anybody seems to realize. Okay. So we know we're in this battle, and we just have to absolutely make sure that we know who our Lord is and that we are totally committed to him, and that we have laid all our sins down before the blood of the Lamb so that we can wash our robes white in the blood of the Lamb and be his faithful companions right to the very end, up to and including martyrdom. Okay. So in verse 17:7, the angel sets out to explain this mystery to John. But the strange thing is, when he starts explaining the mystery of Babylon the Great, he's actually talking about the beast. He's not talking about the harlot at all. And this is where people can get really confused in this text, because while the whole thing is called the punishment of the harlot, it's still the punishment of Babylon as well, because the two of them are actually identified together. Okay, so we now have to look into the mystery of the beast again, and we have done this before in chapter 13, but I'm just going to do what John does here. That's what you do when you're commenting. Okay, so in this drama, the one that's the most important is actually the beast, because that is the enemy of God. The harlot can turn back to her Redeemer whenever she wants. And the reason why the beast is considered the most important is because this is Satan's kingdom, and Satan is the enemy of Christ and the enemy of the church. So you're told that the beast once was, is not, and will yet come out of the abyss. Now that's a conundrum that people just read and pass on. Okay. But this is a parody on Christ, who was with us in the incarnation, is not now physically with us on the earth because he's in heaven, and he will return. Everything that Satan does is a parody on Christ. He mocks him to the very end. And so we have to be really careful to remember what Jesus told us in Matthew 16:3, to read the signs of the times, because the signs are all with us today, that we are within a hair's breadth of this divine judgment in chapter 16. So until the final overthrow of Satan, which is in chapter 20, the overthrow of the beast and the false prophet are in chapter 19, and I'll wait till chapter 20 to explain why there is a difference between the two. But until Satan is finally overthrown, he will always reassert himself again in another form. And so we have to look beyond the surface. We have to look at the actual source of the rebellion against God. If you take an example, the beast comes from the abyss. Do you remember chapter 9? That's the very source of evil. And the harlot is in league with him. Therefore, the harlot is in league with the enemy of God, with Satan. But the lamb that we met in chapter 5, he comes from the very source of all good. He comes from heaven. So you have to look to the source and decide who you're going to, because if you go with Satan, you're going to the abyss, that's where he's going. If you're going with the lamb, you're going to heaven, because that's where he lives. Okay, so what John describes here, when John is talking about this, the Roman Empire was going to be long since gone when this would all come to pass. And we're in the 21st century, and that was the first century. But the woman was going to be in existence for all that length of time. She was there in the first century, and she's there in the 21st century. So the one thread that actually goes through the whole thing is actually the woman. So I don't understand when some of the commentators try to say that the church is not in the second half of the book of Revelation. I don't get it at all, because it doesn't make sense. She's the only thread that runs through the entire thing and makes sense of it all. So I will take this up the next time. Thank you for listening. Slán agus Banach Dé live. Goodbye. God bless you.
Thank you for joining us today. We'd like to hear what you thought of today's session. Share your feedback with us at podcast@shalomworld.org. You can motivate and support us today. shalomworld.org/donate. Visit shalomworld.org for more information about Shalom World podcasts. To get the latest updates, make sure you follow us on Instagram at Shalom World Podcasts. We'll see you right back here tomorrow. Shalom World Podcasts is now available on all online platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, and others.